Welcome to Common Sense Bible Study and our study of Romans. We're in chapter 2, verse 17 tonight. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Okay, I want to review some of the definitions that we've looked at, and actually did complete the table this time. I don't think we really need to go over all these again, except maybe that bottom one that was at the beginning of chapter 2. The judgment of God is just God's decision about who is righteous and wicked. It's really his decision about anything, but that's primarily what he is judging people about. Works, these are things that a person does or says, whether good or bad. Good works, evil works, wicked works, righteous works, anything that you can do. Things that you believe, things that you feel, or momentary thoughts that pass through your head, those are not works. So this is one of those things that Calvinists and Arminians like to argue about, is if I believe in something, is that a work? Personally, I don't think so. I don't think that qualifies as something that you're doing. Even if we are commanded to believe in God, to have faith, there are things that we're commanded to think or not think. And if we're doing them because we're commanded to do it, we're commanded to do it or not do it, that's a work. But if we are believing simply because we're convinced, or even if God has put belief in our heart, whatever it is, that's not a work. That's just something that you believe. Laws, directive or standards of behavior set by a higher authority, whether written or not. That could be laws of Rome, laws, God's laws, Jewish laws, whatever. Those are all law. And what kind of law is being discussed just depends on the context. Something that Tony pointed out in a previous conversation, Tony Pino, not on the call tonight, is that you can frequently tell what Paul means by the word law by looking for the in front of it. And you can't necessarily look at the English translations because they'll frequently insert the where it's not actually there in the Greek. So you have to use a concordance, or if you can read the Greek, look at the Greek to see if that word is actually there. And if it's just saying law, then it could be a more generic sense of law, like law and order. If it says the law, then it's probably talking about a specific law, usually the law of God, but not always. Justified, judged righteous according to God. There are some nuances there that we could talk about, but I think that gets to the point. Work of the law, singular. We read this at the last time. The effect or purpose of a law on a person. In other words, the thing that the law works in you is the work, singular, of the law, or the effect of the law. Works of the law, plural, is kind of like law, where it can mean different things depending on the context. I can't remember if we talked about this or not, but there was one of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls it was actually called Works of the Law, was the name of the scroll in Hebrew, or pretty sure it was Hebrew. And it was talking mostly about detailed laws concerning holiness at the temple. How do you protect the temple and the altar from becoming defiled? So it had lots of rules about how you can associate with Gentiles, what kind of things that you can do before you go to the temple, what kind of things can be brought into the temple. lots of rules like that. And it was called the works of the law. But in other contexts, the idea of the works of the law could be the things that the law dictates, the details. It's usually talking about detailed stuff, whether it's of just traditions or the law itself. Most of the time, I think, when we see this phrase works of the law, it's talking about traditions, like the very detailed Jewish traditions of how you carry out the law, what the rabbis would call halakha or halakha, depending on who you're talking to, which literally means walking out. All right, verses 17 and 18. If you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. This is a really long run-on sentence, which Paul is really great at writing. But there's a lot of stuff to talk about just right here in these two verses. So let's talk about these. He starts out saying, if you call yourself a Jew. Is he saying that people in first century Rome who called themselves Jews might not actually be a Jew? That this is just something they're being called rather than something they are? Could that be part of what he means?
I say, yeah, because when you read the whole thing through, but for no one is Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outwardly a physical, but a Jew is one inwardly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will definitely spend some time talking about that one. And that could be, I think that is part of what Paul's talking about. I don't think he means physically a Jew, like you are not born to Jewish parents. I don't think he's implying that. He's like saying, you call yourself a Jew, but are you behaving like one? Are you doing what a Jew is supposed to do? And, going on with the rest of this first clause in this sentence here, and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve of what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. All of this is defining how a Jew is supposed to behave. But there's a big part of it missing. What would a Jew be relying on the law for? What would a Jew see the purpose of the law? Tell you.
It sets them apart. The law is what identifies the uniqueness of that individual or those people from the rest of the world.
Yeah, and that's definitely the way that Jews looked at it, and still do for that matter. And they can get pretty upset with Gentiles who are keeping commandments that they don't see as applying to non-Jews. I've been told a number of times that Gentiles are forbidden from keeping the Sabbath. Depends on which rabbi you talk to, whether they believe that or not, but some rabbis certainly do. And there are a lot of other commandments. Wearing tzitzit, the tassels on the four corners of a garment, things like that, that definitely make you look different. They do set you apart from other people. And people who are Jewish will see that, and they might be offended because it takes that uniqueness away, or at least they believe it does. And God does say that is one of the purposes of the law, to set his people apart. But it's not the most important thing. There are much more important reasons that we should be relying on the law. Excuse me. One of the things that it seems that at least the people who followed Paul around and were teaching the Gentile converts that they needed to be circumcised and go through this conversion process, one of the things that they seem to believe is that the law would become an advocate for them. That because they kept the law, because they were circumcised and did these things, that makes them a Jew or an Israelite, and that makes them part of the covenant. But there's not really anywhere in Scripture that talks about the law, at least not that I know of, that talks about the law as your advocate, speaking up on your behalf. It does speak on behalf of God. Let me pull up a verse here. It's actually in Romans, just in the next chapter, Romans 3:21 to 22. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So the law, those first 5 books of the law of the Bible, Torah, that bears witness of the righteousness of God. And it's one of the things that we talked about, I think, in chapter 1, is that the righteousness of God is revealed through his commandments, because this tells us about his character. It tells us that he has the right to create law. By virtue of his authority to dictate to mankind how we behave, we know that every commandment that he could possibly give is righteous. I mean, he's the one who created the universe. He sets the rules. And so through the giving of the laws, he establishes his righteousness and his authority to give the laws. Hopefully that makes sense. The law also defines sin. Let me pull up Romans 7:7. Would anybody be willing to read Romans 7:7 for me?
I'll read it. What
Okay,
then
thank you.
shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet. The law had not said, you shall not covet.
Go ahead and read the next verse too, because there's something I want to point out there also.
But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead.
Right, so first, the law tells you what is sin. John tells us that sin is by definition breaking the law. So it seems like a tautology. Sin is breaking the law, and the law tells us what sin is because it tells you what not to do, or what to do, and not doing that is then sin. Yeah, chicken and egg, whichever way that works. But then in verse 8, it also tells us that law not only defines sin, but it will provoke sin in a heart that is ready to sin. So if you've got sin in your heart, if you want to sin, then God telling you, don't do this or do this, provokes you to do that or don't do that. It's like a child when you say, don't touch that. And so they touch it just because. So the law is a witness of God's righteousness. It defines sin. It provokes sin in people with sin in their hearts. It's also a teacher. It teaches us righteous behavior. By defining sin, it teaches us how to behave. Let me also go to Galatians 3:19. I think I've referenced this one before. Yeah.
I think a good example of that would be the garden.
Mm-hmm.
When Yahweh instructs Adam what to eat and not eat. That's, in essence, an example of the law.
Mm-hmm.
So he said what to do and what not to do. And when temptation presented itself, there was a choice to be made. Do I follow the instruction? Now, whether Eve had been instructed or not, you could argue that, but Adam certainly had, and it was up to him to let her know. So without using the concept of the law in terms of Torah, all the do's and don'ts, that's a very simple example of an instruction given. And when temptation was presented specific to that instruction and it was transgressed, sin occurred.
Yeah, that's a good point. In that there's another principle there. When the way that the serpent tempted Eve, Adam had presumably told her what God had said about it, and either he mistold her or she misrepresented it a little bit. But the serpent tempted her by saying, here's the real reason God doesn't want you to do this. And is this thing really going to happen if you touch the apple? Do a little bit in, since God didn't want you to eat it because you would be like him, well, then wouldn't that be a good thing to be more like God? And this is something that we do all the time. And it's both good and bad. We look at God's commandments and we try to decide, why did God say this? And this is a really good thing to do. It's part of meditating on the law. What does this law mean? How would this law apply outside of the narrow circumstances where it was given? The law was given to an agrarian people who was traveling across the desert, heading to a land that they were going to conquer and farm. We have to think a lot about why that law was given in order to apply it in our modern circumstances, especially if you're living in a city, in an apartment. So there's this danger area where we start saying, if God gave this law for this reason, and that reason no longer applies, then do we still have to keep that law? And there is a lot of that. One of the things that I hear very commonly is about food. God said not to eat pork because they didn't have refrigerators. God didn't say don't eat chicken. Can you imagine if you left chicken out in the desert, just sitting out in the sun, and then decided to eat it? That would probably be pretty bad too. Maybe not as bad as pork, but still, it would kill you. So I don't think it had anything to do with refrigeration, especially since they didn't invent refrigerators in the first century. Because the same people who will say that God said not to eat pork because they didn't have refrigerators will say that God changed that law at the cross or at the Sermon on the Mount or in Acts 2. So one of those points. Refrigerators weren't invented then. They weren't invented until 100 years ago.
When I look at the Garden of Eden, I'm glad that I think it was Scott or Joseph brought it up. When I look at the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, here's the choice: the tree of everlasting life, eternal life, or the tree of do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think what's also there's a multi-level layer of meaning. What I see also there is that Eve made a decision that no, God, I want to decide. I want to decide for ourselves or myself. I want to say this is going to be good. I'm
Mhm.
going to say to you, this is not going to be good. In other words, I said you're going to be like us. But I think what was really going on there, they were not ready as mankind, even either thousands of years later, year 2023, we are not right in our own understanding when it comes to sin. We cannot judge for ourselves, this is really good and this is not really good. So I think what's going on so to get back to my point, I think that was one of also the sins, is that to say, not letting the creator of the universe, we are creatures, to decide for us what's right and wrong. We want to tell God, no, this is what's good for us. This is not what's good for us. I think there's a multi-level meaning. That's what I'm getting at. I think there's another layer to understanding sin.
Yeah, let me read this verse in Galatians because I think that speaks to maybe something close to what you're saying. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. It's really just that first part that I want to focus on. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions. The scripture says that Abraham kept all of God's law, but he didn't have the written law. But there's so much, what we talked about in Romans 1, that there's so much of God's law that can be discerned just from nature. But then Abraham also had this personal relationship with the Creator. He was the friend of God. And so he knew God's character. And because he knew God's character, he knew what God expected. And God's expectations are the law. Those are his standards of behavior. They existed before Sinai. Sinai didn't create the law out of whole cloth. It codified it. And what Paul is saying here in Galatians 3:19, I think, is that because the people were sinning, because they weren't keeping God's law, God had to tell them what it is. Because they had convinced themselves that it was okay to worship golden calves. It was okay to give their daughters to pagans and marry their sons to pagan women. And God was saying, okay, no, here it is. Let me spell it out for you. And that's why the law had to be codified, because the people couldn't keep it to begin with. And so there is a deeper principles that extend from the very character of God. And ideally, we shouldn't need a written law. If we really know God's character, we don't need a written law. We don't need him to tell us what to do because we know what he wants. And that kind of goes to the next part of this verse, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. That's Yeshua. If we know him, if we know his character, we don't need the law so much because we just do what he did. Now, of course, we're a long ways separated from what he did, and there's a whole lot of tradition and translations and all kinds of garbage piled on top of that that makes it very hard for us to see him anymore. So we have to go back to the scriptures, because the Old Testament tells us who he is too. And the Torah, the first 5 books, still tells us of Yeshua's character. So if we want to understand the context of the things that are recorded in the Gospels about what he said and did, we have to study all this other stuff. and we have to try to study it within the context in which it was given, and shed these cultural scales that have been put over our eyes by traditions of men. That is a very difficult thing to do, and probably impossible to do that totally, because we're still here speaking English. Okay, so the law is a witness of God's righteousness. It defines sin. It provokes sin. It is a teacher of righteousness. Scrolling down to Galatians 3:24, so then the law was our guardian. This translation is awful. This is probably the worst verse in the entire English Standard Version. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. That is totally wrong. I'm going to switch over to the Tree of Life version. Therefore, the Torah became our guardian to lead us to Messiah so that we might be made right based on trusting. It wasn't a guardian until Messiah came. It was a guide to Messiah, and not just a guide to the person, but a guide to becoming like him. We are his disciples. We are supposed to emulate him, and the Torah teaches us how to do that. God's law teaches us how to be like Jesus, like Yeshua. And another verse along that same. So Romans 9:31, but Israel, who pursued a Torah of righteousness, did not reach the Torah. That one's a little awkward. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. This is, again, the Torah leads us to righteousness. If you are obeying God's law in the way that God wants it obeyed, it will lead you to Messiah. It will lead you to true righteousness. But they didn't get there because they misused it. They didn't use it and obey it in the way that God had meant. And there's a final thing that I want to show, that the law is also a witness of sin. And back to Romans 3:19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. So that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. The law witnesses to your sin by telling you with very little ambiguity, here's what God expects. Do this, don't do that. When you do what the law says not to do, or when you don't do what it does say to do, it is then a witness against you. It's like you have no excuse. Not only do you have the nature to look at as a witness of God's character, but now you have the written law. How much more do you need? So what was that? 5 things? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. 5 purposes of the law: to be a witness of God's righteousness and his character, to define sin, to lead us to righteousness and Messiah, to provoke sin. Sorry, I missed that one. And to be a witness of sin. Any other comments on this verse or any questions? All right, let's move on to verses 19 and 20. Same sentence, just carrying on. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. And again, it's just part of the sentence, but there's a lot to talk about here. Okay, who's got Isaiah 49:6?
This is the New King James Version. Indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to him whom despises.
That's good. Thanks, Joseph. This verse, like so much of Isaiah's prophecies, is a double entendre, where it's speaking of both Israel and Messiah at the same time. So when it says, I will make you a light of the nations, it's first speaking to Israel. Israel will be a light to the nations. But then it's also speaking to the Messiah. It's a prophecy of Messiah. Messiah will be a light to the nations. But one of the ways that Messiah is a light to the nations is by us emulating Messiah. We're to become mirrors to show his light to the rest of the world. But we can't do that unless we are polished in reflecting his light. We have to be like him. And so when Paul says, if you're so sure that you're a guide to the blind and a light to those who are in darkness, they really are supposed to be a light in the darkness. This is what they expect to be because God said they would be. But they're missing the point in that you're not automatically a light to the world just because you're born a Jew or because you're born into a Christian family or you go to church. You've heard the thing that just going to McDonald's doesn't make you a hamburger. Hanging out in the garage doesn't make you a car. Being born a Jew doesn't make you a light to the world. You have to emulate Messiah to do that.
When we were talking earlier about the sin in the garden and different layers of meaning, I mean, that one layer where it's like to be like God, we emulate God, we reflect God. There's that, and then there's the option to not do that. But then there's also the being like God, meaning being our own God. And I think that's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That, just like the serpent deceiving deceiving Eve, that you can be like God by disobeying God. That's that's the motivation behind a lot of organized sin. The whole idea behind the Mormon church, not the whole idea, but one of the big ideas in the Mormon church is that you can be a God yourself. If I don't know what their rules are. Go get baptized, wear the right clothes. I don't know what their rules are, so I'm not going to pretend to know. But the end goal is that you are a God of your own little world. Yeah, and to be honest, in my experience, ironically, Mormons frequently do reflect that light a lot better than other people who call themselves Christians. So maybe that's
Or
a
at least
bad
superficially,
example.
maybe they seem to.
Yeah, at least in their interactions with other people, or in their interactions with me. Maybe I should put it that way.
Yeah.
I can't really speak for other people. Excuse me. Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, with the Mormons, I lived in Idaho for some time, so I'm very familiar.
Mhm.
And they want to be obedient, and I could appreciate that part of it, but
Mhm.
they're being obedient to the wrong
Yeah.
thing. And it's so sad because we see so many people who confess Christ yet are living in disobedience, and it's not just it, we as Christians, we should be there for each other and help each other. And it just seems like you're like alone sometimes. I don't know. Maybe that's how I felt at times. And
Mhm.
it would just be nice if we took it more seriously, because you have these other religions that are false religions, but they are showing dedication,
Yeah.
obedience. And it's like, where is that from the self-proclaimed Christians? And
Mhm.
it's amazing because I don't understand the patience of God. That's something I'm still trying to understand at times. But it's sad that we tend to take his grace for granted sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that verse 19 especially is pointed right at the Torah movement. We spend all of our time studying in, learning what all the details of the law, and we spend so very little time going out into the world and serving people. We might serve our community, and I know that there are exceptions. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know that there are a lot of exceptions, but on the whole, I don't really see a lot of that. I don't see Messianic or Hebrew roots or Torah, whatever congregations spending a lot of time feeding the homeless. Individuals will certainly do that kind of thing, but not in any kind of organized effort. But if you look at the Catholic Church, wall-to-wall idolatry, but they do a lot to help poor. They do a lot of education. They feed and they clothe people. They house people. The same thing with Mormons and a lot of other Christian groups. Not all of them. There's a pretty wide variety of behavior and I don't know what you want to call it, support systems for doing that kind of work. Some churches are really good at it. Some churches not so much. Some churches are lucky if they do a trunk or treat at Halloween. And I mean that totally facetiously.
To jump on what Kevin was talking about, I think that there's a difference between earnestness and discernment. And I think Romans is talking about, or at least it's starting to flesh out, the idea of discernment, because there's so many. You brought up the Mormons earlier. That's earnestness to it, or those that follow Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, or whatever else, whatever other religion out there. You have people that are going to be very gung-ho to follow what is put before them, but that's what they're doing. They're following somebody else's teaching. They're not appropriating it for themselves. That's something to factor into this, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Who's got Matthew 15, verses 14 and 16?
I got it. Let them alone, they are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said to him, explain the parable to us. And he said, are you also still without understanding? Do you not
Right.
see that what...
That's good.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and that seems a weird place to stop, but
It is.
I think it fits what Paul is saying here, because even Peter at this point was still a blind guide. He wasn't ready to go out and teach other people. At this point, Yeshua had already sent the disciples out on one mission trip, but only within the land of Israel, only to other Jews. It was only much later, after they had gone through, spent somewhere between 1.5 to 3 years under his direct tutelage, after Pentecost, and then after several more years, that they finally started going out and really preaching the gospel, because they just weren't ready. And Peter, even being at Yeshua's side day after day for months, he still didn't get it. He still really didn't understand what it was all about. And we even see that in Acts 9, where, I can't remember who was it, Cornelius, who sent 3 men to Peter and say, come tell us about this Messiah and baptize us. And Peter probably would not have gone with them if God had not given him the vision of the sheet with the animals in it 3 times for 3 visitors. So even that far ahead, Peter still needed to be corrected and taught. We're all still learning. Nobody is perfect. No teacher knows everything. And one of the great ways of learning is to teach something. And I'm certainly learning a lot by going through this Roman series. I don't know if I'm teaching you guys anything any more than I'm learning, or any less than I'm learning. But the teacher does need to have some understanding. He needs to be, it can't just be head knowledge. And it seems to that was one of the biggest problems with many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and these other sects, is that they were so caught up in getting the details right that they were missing the purpose of the whole law. They were seeing all the trees of the law without seeing the forest.
Well, and they distance themselves from the people, which is where we actually are meant to carry out the law, is with our brothers and sisters. So if you distance yourself like that, because you want to be pure, so holy, so whatever, eventually you don't have anything to test you. You don't have anything to sharpen you. You don't have anything to make this real. Nothing to bump up against.
Yeah, and it's the real life. It's bumping up against things that gives you the wisdom necessary to teach the fools. If you are a fool going out to teach fools, you're not going to get anywhere. And so the way to learn wisdom isn't just to read the letter of the law or prophets or writings, whatever it is. That's not enough. You then have to put it into practice, and you have to understand the heart of the commandments, which again is going back to that thing of trying to decipher why God set a commandment. And that's dangerous territory, but it's still a vital part of understanding the law, is getting at the why. And we're not always going to know the why.
Can I
Go
mention
ahead.
something about the next couple verses of Matthew? Because I think there's
Sure,
some relation. With 17, 18, 19, it says, Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled, but whatever comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles the person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. And it just makes me think about, we're talking about light, and it makes me think about that light should be emanating from within us, right? It should be coming from our hearts that have been circumcised, changed, transformed. But I think about, he's talking about something that goes into your mouth that you eat is just going to go through you. Eventually it turns into waste. But what comes out of you really comes from what's digested, what's starting to transform you, right? And I see like the words of God as that, and even that confession, like confessing the words of God, speaking the words of God, agreeing with the words of God. When those things come from our mouths, that is a light. That's one of the ways that we're transformed. But it's also one of the ways, if we are in agreement with God, saying, yes, your word is true. Yes, this commandment is just. So I will do this thing. Those are the ways that we're putting ourselves in agreement and we're reflecting his character.
Yeah, good word. Thank you. Who's got Psalm 19, 7 and 8?
Randy's got it. The law of the
All right,
Lord
Randy.
is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. And
Very
Polly,
good.
you
Thank
said
you.
a while ago about bumping into something, and I heard it said one time, if you ain't bumping into the devil every now and then, you're going the wrong way.
Yeah,
It's a good one.
he's not trying to stop you. Yeah, so Paul says that you who think that you're a guide to the blind and a light to those in the darkness and an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, and having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. But David in this psalm seems to be saying that the law really does embody knowledge and truth, and it does transform people. It is a teacher. He says that it restores the soul. It makes wise the simple. So studying and teaching the law really does do these things that Paul is saying the Jews claimed it does. They weren't wrong. It's not that the law doesn't do those things. It's the misapplication of the law that's the problem. Now, who's got Psalm 119:66?
I could do that one also. 119:66. And I'm reading from the ISV, so hopefully this will be more of
Okay.
appealing. Hopefully this will be a more appealing translation. Teach me both knowledge and appropriate discretion, because I believe in your commands.
That's interesting. I like that. Appropriate discernment. So this is because I believe in your commandments. Where are the commandments? In the law. Because I believe in your commandments that you gave us in the law, you will teach me appropriate discernment and knowledge. So again, the law does embody knowledge and truth. That itself is not the problem. I mentioned earlier that no teacher is perfect, and there's some preparation required. That Peter, when he was still with Yeshua, he wasn't yet qualified to be a teacher. At least he wasn't qualified to be the apostle that Yeshua needed him to be. Wanting to be a teacher is a good thing. Paul says that to Timothy, I think. And certainly God wants all of his people to understand his law and his character enough to teach it to other people. That's one of the roles that Israel is supposed to have in the world. They're supposed to be a light to the nations. The prophets also say that the law will go out from Jerusalem to all the nations. So this is one of the roles of Israel, is to teach God's law to the nations. But one of the things that I think Paul might be warning against here, when he says a teacher of children, is not despising the people that you're teaching. And this was a big problem with those works of the law. Peter talked about how, or was that Paul? No, I think it was Peter. Can't remember for sure. Oh yeah, it was Peter, because it was in after that same vision. He's saying, you know how in our law it says that I'm not supposed to come eat with a Gentile. That's not God's law. That's a man-made law. And that causes people to despise the Gentiles. Maybe not despise them in the way that, you Gentiles are awful, horrible people, but there's a spiritual taint on Gentiles, and I don't want to be around you because then maybe I can't go to the temple. That kind of behavior, it causes people to look down on them. There's another passage, I don't remember, in Revelation 1 or 2. Let me find it here real quick, and then I'll bring it up. Revelation 2:6. Yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And Revelation 2:15. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now, there's some disagreement about who the Nicolaitans were. Maybe they were followers of this guy named Nicholas, who was teaching people to eat food sacrificed to idols and to eat unclean meat. Or another idea that I believe is that I lean towards, I don't really know, but this word is a combination of two words that means ruling over the laity, or ruling over the common people. And that these were self-appointed priestly class saying, we are the ones who are authorized to teach God's commandments. We study the scriptures and you learn it from us. And for 1500 years, this was the approach of the Catholic Church. We're going to read the scriptures. You're not allowed to have them. You're not allowed to read them for yourselves because you're going to mess them all up. You're going to misunderstand it all. You have to rely on us because only somebody who's learned and taught can really understand it and be able to teach it to you. But that's not what God wants for his people. He wants them all to understand the law. He wants them to read the scriptures for themselves, or to hear it at least, and to understand it for themselves. And if there's a class of people who are holding themselves above everybody else and saying, you're not qualified, you can't possibly understand the scriptures for yourself, so you need me to teach it to you, those people are kind of who Paul is talking about here. Maybe they're not Jews, maybe they are, but they see themselves as teachers of children, which in itself is not a bad thing, as long as you are teaching the children to become grown-ups, because that's the end goal. If you are teaching the children so that they will always remain children and always see you as the authority and the teacher, there's a problem. Now everything's all messed up, and you're never going to teach them what they really need to know to become the teachers themselves.
You almost, Jay, have two different approaches that exist in almost all churches today, and I'd say even the Indiana community, because I've experienced it myself. And that is where you have the people who want a king. They want somebody that they can follow and that they can learn from. And then you have the people that are quote unquote gifted, and they quote unquote function within that gifting, but they are imparting their knowledge. They're looking for followers. I mean, I've been to a number of fellowships, and I don't like it, whereby everyone looks to the person that's the loudest or the most confident in whatever they're presenting. It's usually an older person. That's just my experience. But they may be learning something in the word, and they say, oh, what does Baruch say? Or what does whomever that person is? They look to that person to basically clarify what has been said, and then they just march in lockstep with that. That's what I'm seeing in many situations that exist now.
Yeah, it's analogous to cancer, where you've got an organ or a cell that's doing a good thing, but then it gets off balance. It starts growing too much in one place. It's a good thing to want to be a teacher, which means you need students. It's a good thing to want to go out and find the students to teach. It's not a good thing to want to keep the students as students and never let them grow to become the teachers. And on the other side, it's a good thing to want to go out and find teachers, to find somebody who can lead you and help you to understand the word. But we all start out without the confidence or the knowledge to really understand scripture. In reading it just on your own, without any input, is probably going to get you into trouble. You know, we all need teachers and people to help us understand to one extent or another, but you can't stay there. It's like the Hebrews in the wilderness. You're not supposed to stay in the wilderness. Eventually, you have to cross the Jordan and start conquering the land. And people who just want to sit in the pew and be a spectator and enjoy the teachings or whatever it is they do, it's not as malignant a cancer, but it's still a cancer in the body. You're supposed to be growing and becoming the teacher yourself.
Yeah, to that point, when I first became a follower of Messiah, I noticed something different than what the scriptures were teaching, and that was just discipleship and how we do church, and the American way to do things was a lot different than what I was seeing in the scriptures. And from what I've read, we really should be making disciples and then them making disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just keeps going on. Right?
Yeah.
And who am I? Who's Kevin? I graduated college and stuff. But that means nothing. There's nothing that qualifies me except the Spirit of God that's in me. And I love talking about Christ and sharing that with other people, sharing that with
Mm-hmm.
my kids. And what I get a lot is, wait, you don't have any qualifications? You didn't go to seminary? What, who are you to say this?
Yeah.
Are you Jesus? And I just tell the people, if there's anything that I'm saying that's not in scripture, then I'm ready for rebuke. But here's what the scriptures say. And we live in this day and age where we have celebrity pastors and all this, and
Mm-hmm.
our culture is programmed to think that way. And we don't put ourselves in the shoes of people in the day that Christ walked. And we're just looking for, just like what Scott was saying, I just thought it was a really good point, how we just want to listen to whoever's preaching, and that's it. We go to church and we're done. And
Mm-hmm.
I just really don't like that type of way of thinking, because when I read the scriptures, it's just radically different. And just wanted to make that point about the culture, how it influences our thought process and what we think we need as a leader. And I don't know if this was a Puritan thing, but I loved how they focused so much on family. And it was like the man and then the woman and then the children, like it seemed like they really cared about that governmental unit.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that. Whereas like I've known friends where their wives are just looking for the pastor, not their husband, to lead. And it's the same with kids. The kids are looking to Sunday school or whatever you call it, right? They're looking for someone else to teach the kids when it should be the husband's responsibility. So we just have we need some type of reform in that sense of learning that the family unit plays a major role in how we're shaping the church.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah. God says repeatedly, teach your children my law. When you're walking on the roads, when you're in your home, when you're at your business, in the marketplace, always be teaching your children my law. He even says, write it on the doorposts of your homes. And whether you take that literally or figuratively, the idea is that everything you do is centered on God's law, and your first disciples are your children. You teach your children to be disciples themselves, and that is our primary mission field. Only when our own houses are in order should we then be reaching out to everybody else. Jules, go ahead.
No, it just reminded me about talking about teaching. Should we or should we not teach? Like I look in the mirror every day. I like to be helpful and to bring simple teachings to anyone who want to listen. There's a wonderful parable or a Michelle that the Hebrews use, and it's a very old rabbinical story they would come up with, use these metaphors, imageries. Think about teaching. Think about the Sea of Galilee, and think of the importance that when using the Sea of Galilee and having water flowing in, teaching coming in, what's so important that keeps the Sea of Galilee alive and vibrant, it pushes out. It
Hmm.
pushes out. So the importance of like you, whatever you receive as a student, you need to also as become that a level of teaching to teach it out, push it out. And you should not be like the Sea of Galilee. You receive it in, soak it in, and there's a
Yeah, the
reason why
Dead
it's
Sea.
because they never make the effort to teach it out. There's got to be
Hmm.
a balance. That's what I'm saying. It's a beautiful little parable that I think that it proves a point. There should be a level for all of us to try to teach something. There's something you can do.
Hmm. Yeah, and you know why the Dead Sea is dead? Because all that salt accumulates there, all those minerals, and we're supposed to be the salt of the world, but not in the sense that we just become more and more salty ourselves, but so that salt goes out into the world. If it doesn't go out, yeah, it's just poison. I like that analogy. That's good. Something else that Kevin said reminded me when people, I've had the same thing where people come to you and say, who are you to reject all of this learning and traditions from many centuries? And it's a valid point. I don't have the learning that all of these great teachers have had over the many centuries. I'm sure that John Calvin and Martin Luther and Zwingli and Melanchthon, however you pronounce his name, I'm sure that all these guys had way more learning in scripture than I do. They had memorized a lot of it. They had read it more times than I have, but that doesn't make them right about everything. That's the same problem where that teacher who puts himself at the top and keeps everybody else down, looking at the teachers who came before us in that same way, it's the same problem. Even if they're not putting themselves up on a pedestal like that, if we're putting them up there on a pedestal, we're making idols out of dead people. We're not necessarily praying to them. I only mean that metaphorically, of course. But just because somebody knows a lot doesn't mean they're always going to be right. And we should proceed very cautiously. If I believe something that almost 2,000 years of biblical scholarship believes something differently, I should be very cautious with that. I should make doubly sure that the scriptures are actually saying what I believe they say before I start telling other people, because there's a very good chance that I'm wrong.
So to clarify,
Hmm.
you're not always right.
Let's not get carried away. Yeah, that's true. I'm not always right. And I am probably wrong more often than I know. And in fact, I know that I'm wrong more often than I know, because if I knew I was wrong, I wouldn't be wrong anymore.
This is being recorded.
Yeah. Or posterity.
I'm just kidding.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, on your point about, the joking about you're not always right. Again, it's our culture, and culture's so frustrating. I guess
Mhm.
every culture has dealt with the culture that they were brought up in, and it's very anti-Christ. But when I look at, I shouldn't have to always be right to speak truth, right?
Mhm.
There might be a time where the president of the United States of America, Joe Biden, might say something that's truthful, but for the 97% of the time, he can't even speak.
Yeah.
I can get credit to someone who I don't respect, or maybe I don't like. I can
Mhm.
give respect if they say that say something that's true. And I think that's part of being humble, is understanding that like not everyone is right. I disagree so much with a lot of how some of my friends think, and that's okay. In the culture today, though, if you disagree, it's really bad. And can't talk to you anymore. We can't have difference of opinion. But I just wanted to point out that because of our culture, they're like, okay, you always need to be right to say something or to speak. And it feels like that, if you know what I'm saying, because I did something wrong or I may have not done something right, then I just lose all respect and no one could listen to me again. That's going to happen because we're just men.
Mhm.
So I just hope that when people, if we just humble ourselves to, we may disagree with someone, but we can at least accept when they are right, and we can research or we can look into it to see if they're right about that thing, not base it upon what they said in the past.
Yeah. And just because they're wrong about one thing doesn't necessarily make them wrong about another thing. And I have some personal hangups about certain beliefs. There's a handful of things where I tend to think that if someone holds this belief, then they're very unlikely to be able to teach or understand more complicated things accurately. I'm not going to get into what those specific beliefs are because that would be an irrelevant rabbit trail. But I was having a conversation with some of the men in our local community recently about what are some beliefs. If you went to a Torah keeping congregation, what are some beliefs that would be total deal killers for you? You would not be able to fellowship with this group. And for the most part, we had some very similar ideas. But that did get me thinking about some of those beliefs that I am so opposed to that I don't trust a teacher who believes them. If there's a teacher who believes this, I can't listen to him on anything else because that shows such a lack of discernment that it throws everything else into question. Now, I still have some lines like that. If somebody teaches that God is A-okay with homosexuality, all right, we're done. You've got nothing else to say to me that I care to listen to. You may have some good ideas about, I don't know, mathematics or something totally unrelated, but I'm not going to listen to that guy about anything spiritual. He's not going to be my Bible teacher. But there are other ideas that aren't necessarily immoral. They may be stupid, in my opinion, or they may actually be stupid. They may be completely ridiculous, but they're not teaching a sin. So what do I have to say that this person, because they believe this idea that I think is ridiculous, that they must be wrong about everything else spiritual? I'm pretty sure that I've got some pretty stupid ideas. I just don't know what they are yet. Hopefully I'll figure it out before too long. But it's just earlier today, I went through my Twitter block list and I unblocked all those teachers that are teaching those particular ideas, because I need to be able to communicate with people who are not on the same wavelength. As long as we are worshiping the same God, we're on the same side. I got to find a way to work with people who believe things I disagree with, as long as it's not somebody preaching outright sin. We did get off on a rabbit trail there a little bit, but it's all right. It was a good one.
I got a thought on that rabbit trail. One thing I'll just mention what has been cracking the concrete, as it were. There's a really big movement going around of Arianism. They don't call it Arianism because that's an ugly word, but the created Jesus movement is super strong. There's several teachers that one of the more popular teachers of this notion. I'm actually an admin, or was an ad. Actually, he hasn't taken me off as admin on his live streams. So it was just, I have to restrain myself. I don't even really listen to it anymore because I just get a stomachache. But there is an entire theological mechanism that is subtle and greasy that it's slid into a lot of Torah movements, and a lot of Torah people have it because of an opposition of a certain ism that I'm not going to bother going into because I don't agree with that either. But I'm having now conversations with another Torah group I'm in because it's a fairly large group and there's a predominant created Messiah thing going on, and I literally have to I have to be reasonable as far as the words that I choose, but I constantly am throwing hand grenades in there and trying to put together a reasonable affront to that, and ended up having actually a really good conversation. Because a guy hit me in the DMs and said, "Can you please just explain to me about why you think Jesus wasn't created?" So I was able to like share some of the scriptural understanding from all the way back from Genesis, and even the Yahweh calling down fire from Yahweh and some of these other elements where it was clearly a theophany, and describing the title of sonship and everything else. But that is a really big deal. You wouldn't think so, but I think it really affects people's walk. And because I've noticed that people that believe that in their daily conversations, they almost seem to become more mystical and agnostic in their other conversations because of how they feel about this very fundamental, foundational, I think almost a cornerstone of the whole deal. Anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. And I think you're right. Depends on what you mean by throwing hand grenades in, but those beliefs can't be left unchallenged. We have to confront them. It's just how we do it is important. And
that was a hyperbolic. That was very hyperbolic.
I figured,
we still all love each other and we're still working through it. And I do try to address things in a diplomatic type way with an abundance of contextual scripture to try to reason my way out of it. And thankfully, there's a few other people that when they're reminded of a lot of it is people just forget certain scriptures. Oh, okay, yeah. Then suddenly you'll see a few more comments. Yeah, I believe that. And then of course, thankfully it gets diffused because we move on.
Yeah, it reminds me of that proverb where it says that the first one to bring his case to court sounds like he's telling the truth until the next guy comes and refutes him. And
absolutely, yeah,
if somebody presents a few verses that seem to back up an idea and it sounds reasonable, it's that makes sense. But it frequently makes sense because they've left out some other verses that bring some clarity or refute that idea.
It makes me think about how important, there are some scripture references to the whole testimony. That's part of our challenge, is to be able to bring the whole testimony of Yeshua to people.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's at least try to finish this sentence. Verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? This is really saying much of what we already covered. These people who were studying the law and telling everybody else what the law said, they thought simply by having knowledge. These are really hypothetical statements. Paul doesn't actually know anybody in Rome. He's never been there. So he's not pointing to anybody and saying, you've been teaching the law, but you don't even follow the law. He's heard about disputes that are going on. And so he's presenting hypothetical statements like, if you believe that you know the law and you're special just because you know it and you're qualified to teach other people, or you think you are you actually following the law? Are you actually doing what God said to do? And if not, you've got no business teaching other people. In the second half, the second sentence, while you preach against stealing, do you steal? Maybe there were people there who were actually stealing, but I don't think that's the point. He's just giving an example from the law. Are you really a thief? I don't know. Any other thoughts on this verse?
Yeshua in Mark 7 was when he was talking to the Pharisees about, because they were challenging the ritual handling. This may not have nothing to do with it, but the Pharisees in their oppressive theology were making Corban, the gifts that the people were making in the temple, and thus stealing the respect that the commandment of respecting your parents and providing and all that other stuff. They're saying, oh, just give it to the temple and that will cover that. That's like a stealing, like a shady deal. telling them they're justified because they've given to the Pharisees. That might have been a little bit going on.
The 20
or something like
verse
that.
we're on here. Yeah, we'll actually get to a more specific mention of that in the next verse. I think it's, the next verse. Yeah, maybe that's what he had in mind, because he did get to that. Yeah, let's go on to verse 22. You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Obviously, the committing adultery, all Jews know that committing adultery is wrong. So whether he's saying, but it is also a problem. We know from the news all the time that people who are in charge of congregations, whether they're rabbis or pastors or whoever they are, they're frequently caught in sexual sins. And it's one of the reasons that Paul put a husband of one wife or a husband of a wife, however you want to read that, into his qualifications of an overseer and an elder, is because this is a big temptation for men who are in authority to take advantage of women who are under that umbrella. But it's also about the heart. Are you, even if you're not committing adultery or stealing or whatever it is, actually doing that in the physical world, do you still harbor that in your heart? Do you still think about it all the time? Are you still wanting what other people have? The second half is a little bit more difficult to understand, and different translations will word this differently. You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? The King James puts this, thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Now, committing sacrilege against a pagan temple, he's talking to people in Rome. So obviously nobody in Rome is going to the temple in Jerusalem. They might go there occasionally, but they're not doing it in Rome because the temple isn't there. There are no legitimate temples in Rome to rob. So sacrilege is what he's getting at, but is it really sacrilege if you commit sacrilege against a pagan temple? I don't think so. I'll insult all the pagan gods in the world, and I don't think there's a single thing wrong with that. Now, sometimes there's some value in being polite to pagans and not just like rubbing their face in the fact that their gods are false. But I don't think that's really what Paul is getting at here. Saying you abhor idols, but then do you turn around and I think a literal translation of this word for rob temples is, are you a temple robber? So like kind of like being, are you a drunk? You who abhor substance abuse, are you a drunk? It's, you may abhor the false idols. You may abhor paganism, but then are you treating God like he's a pagan God? Are you robbing his temple? Are you neglecting to send your tithes to the temple, or are you making vows and then not fulfilling them? You know, think of Ananias and Sapphira in, I think it's Acts 5, where they said they were going to sell their house and give all the proceeds to the apostles. Well, they sold their house, gave part of the proceeds, and said they gave it all. Well, God struck them both dead. And it's not because they didn't give all of their proceeds of the sale of their house to the apostles. It's because they said they were giving it, specifically because they were giving it to God's ministry. And then they didn't do it and said they did. Well, God isn't a pagan idol. He's not a false God. He hears you. He knows when you're making a promise. He knows what you owe him and what you don't. So if you go and you vow something to a pagan God and you don't fulfill that vow, does that hurt anything? It hurts you because you made a false promise. But that God isn't listening to you. He doesn't care about you one way or another. He's going to harm you no matter what you do. If there's an actual spirit behind the God that you're worshiping, his only goal is to do you harm. So what difference does it make whether you fulfill your vows to him? But if you make a vow to the real God and then treat him as if he's a pagan God, like your vows don't matter, you're stealing from God, and this is really going to hurt you. God doesn't want to hurt you. You're hurting yourself. Does that make sense with this rob temples?
I'm thinking it a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking it's saying that, are you willing to sin, because robbing is sin,
mm-hmm.
under the name of some sort of justification? In other words, are you, as an abortion rights opponent, That's the right word. If you're against abortion, are you going to go out and kill a abortion doctor and say you're justified? You're acting in a sinful manner, but justifying it because of some sort of mechanism.
Or, yeah, justifying a sin based on some higher moral principle or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that definitely
Like
brings
stealing.
shame on God's name. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And, another interpretation of this is, what if the Jews were actually stealing from pagan shrines? It's very common that if there's a shrine to some god, people come and bring gifts and they leave it there, whether it's food or small amounts of gold or silver. And usually that's given for the priests there. But, if you don't believe that those gods are real anyways, I mean, what kind of scruples would you have against stealing from a temple when people are giving offerings to a false god? But it's still not yours. It's still stealing. And just because it's a false god and you think you're doing the world a favor by stealing from an idol, doesn't mean that it's the right thing. So that's kind of along the same lines that you're thinking, I think. I hadn't thought of it in quite that way, though.